The gavel struck the stone podium for the third time, and still no hand rose. I had not come to the summit of packs to buy anyone. I had come to Ashenvale, that ancient, smoke-stained hall where the 5 great packs of the Northern Realm gathered once each decade to trade grain rights, hunting borders, and allegiance, to settle a boundary dispute with the Ironfin pack and be gone before the first snow closed the mountain roads. My advisor Karan had warned me that the summit's final evening always ended in what the other packs called the gift auction. Surplus wolves, unclaimed omegas, pack members whose original packs could no longer keep them, offered to any household willing to pay their placement fee and take them in. He had warned me to leave before it began. I had not listened. I stood at the back of the great hall with my arms folded and my jaw set, watching the auctioneer, a heavy-set man from the Grayville pack with a silver chain of office around his neck and the practiced boredom of someone who had done this 100 times, work through his evening roster. Wolves with building skills went fast. A pair of brothers who were trained hunters raised a brief bidding war between the Ironfin and Dunmore packs. A woman with a gift for forging iron armor went to the Westhello Alpha before the auctioneer had finished his second sentence. Then the auctioneer called the last name on his list. Lot 14, the Omega Sierra, formerly of the Cressmere pack, age 23, no wolf shift recorded. He read it flatly as though even the description bored him. Starting bid, 40 silver. She walked out from behind the partition. I do not know what I expected. What I saw was a young woman in a plain gray dress, her dark hair pulled back with a piece of cord, her hands folded quietly in front of her. She was not performing composure, that rigid, held-still quality you see in someone who has schooled themselves against tears. She was simply composed. Her eyes moved once across the assembled hall, reading the room the way a careful person reads weather, and then she fixed her gaze at a point just above the crowd and held it there. 40 silver, the auctioneer said. Do I have 40 silver? Silence. The hall was full of alphas and their advisors, 36 people at least, and not one of them moved. I watched the alpha of the Dunmore pack lean toward his neighbor and mutter something. I watched the Westhello advisor shake his head. I watched the Grayville alpha's wife look at the girl on the platform, the way one looks at an object one has already decided is not worth carrying home. No wolf shift, someone said in the crowd, not quietly enough. What use is an omega without a wolf? Cressmere cast her out last winter, another voice added. Their own pack didn't want her. 30 silver then, the auctioneer said, revising without ceremony. Starting bid of 30. Still nothing. She did not flinch. That was the thing I could not stop seeing. Every other person sold in that hall tonight had reacted to the bidding, the pride of being wanted or the relief, or in the case of the young Hunter brothers, the barely suppressed pleasure of being fought over. This girl's face was still, not cold, not empty. Still, the way deep water is still, not because nothing lives in it, but because it runs too deep to disturb. 20 silver, the auctioneer said. There was now a distinct edge of impatience in his voice. Surely someone. She's healthy. She has letters from the Cressmere healer attesting to her skill with medicinal herbs and general household management. 20 silver, final call. The hall did not answer. I felt something move in my chest then, not the bond, not yet, though I did not know that at the time. I felt something older and plainer, anger. I had presided over many courts and many councils, and I knew the particular cruelty of a room full of people choosing, in unspoken agreement, to ignore someone. It was not the cruelty of the slap or the shout. It was the cruelty of the turned back, the dropped gaze, the decided indifference. I had spent 10 years as alpha of Ironhollow watching my own border villages receive exactly that treatment from the great southern packs. The deliberate, comfortable silence of people who had decided that someone else's difficulty was not worth the cost of caring. I did not make a decision exactly. My hand simply rose. 100 silver, I said. The hall turned. I had not spoken loudly. I rarely need to, but the shift was immediate. 30 pairs of eyes found me at the back of the room, and I watched the Dunmore Alpha's eyebrows climb toward his hairline, and the Grayville advisor's mouth open slightly. The auctioneer stared for a moment before he recovered his professional composure. 100 silver, he repeated, from forgive me, my lord, for the record. Roanvelthar, I said, Alpha of Ironhollow. The room was very quiet. Ironhollow was not one of the 5 great packs represented here. We were the 6th pack, the northern pack, the cold pack, the one the southern alphas tended to speak of with a mixture of wary respect and polite condescension, the way one speaks of a reliable but inconvenient neighbor. We were large and we were old, and we had survived things that had broken other packs. We were not fashionable. 100 silver, the auctioneer said again, with considerably more energy. Any advance on 100 silver? Nothing, of course nothing. The hall had already decided she was not worth 40. They were not going to try to outbid the Northern Alpha for an Omega they didn't want. The gavel came down. I looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time since I had raised my hand. She was looking at me, not with gratitude, which I noticed, not with the reflexive relief I might have expected. She was looking at me with that same clear, measuring gaze she had turned on the whole hall, and in it was a simple, direct question. Why? I did not have a good answer, not yet. My advisor Karan reached me in 3 strides, his expression suggesting he had several things to say and was heroically suppressing all of them. My lord, he said. I know, I said. The council will. I know Karan. She has no wolf, the Cressmere Pack's record shows. I read the record. I had not actually. I had not known she existed until 5 minutes ago. See to the payment and the paperwork. We ride at dawn. He closed his mouth. Whatever he saw in my face, it stopped him. He turned to handle the clerk, and I walked forward through the parting crowd to where the auctioneer's assistant was already guiding her down from the platform. She stopped when she saw me coming. She did not step back. She did not bow, though she was an Omega in a hall full of alphas, and most would have expected it. My lord, she said. Her voice was quiet and even, a careful voice accustomed to being precise. Sira, I said. It felt strange to say a name I had learned 30 seconds ago as though I already knew it, but strange was not wrong. You'll ride to Ironhollow in the morning with my party. You'll be housed and fed and paid fairly for whatever work you choose to take on. You are not a prisoner and you are not a debt, and no one at Ironhollow will treat you as either. I paused. Is that acceptable? She was quiet for a moment. Something in the measuring look shifted, not to trust, which she did not owe me, but to a careful acknowledgement, the way one acknowledges an unexpected fair deal before deciding whether to take it. Yes, my lord, she said, it is acceptable. That was how it began. The road to Ironhollow took 3 days in the early snow, and I am not a man who makes conversation easily on the road, or, as Karan has observed with the resigned accuracy of a man who has advised me for 15 years, off the road either. I noticed things, however. I noticed that she did not complain. The mountain road was cold and the pace was hard, and 2 of my younger guards were visibly miserable by the second afternoon, rotating between their cloaks and their complaints. She rode without complaint on the spare horse we had arranged at the last village, a steady gray mare who clearly liked her better than she liked most people. I noticed that she had practical knowledge. When we stopped the first night at a roadside wayhouse, and one of my guards came in from cold scouting with his hands badly cracked from the frost, she had a small kit out of her saddlebag before anyone asked her, and his hands were wrapped and clean before he had finished thanking her. She did not make a performance of it, did not look around to see if anyone noticed, did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply saw what was needed and addressed it, and returned to her meal. I noticed that she watched people with the same attention she gave to everything else, not nosily, not intrusively, but with the quality of genuine interest. One of the younger guards, a boy of perhaps 17 who had clearly never been this far north and was equal parts excited and nervous about the prospect, fell into conversation with her on the second afternoon, and I watched from ahead as something in the rigid set of his shoulders slowly released over the course of an hour's riding. She asked good questions. That was what I observed. She asked the kind of questions that make people feel that what they know is worth knowing, and then she listened to the answers. I noticed that she was watchful, not nervous watchful. There is a difference. Nervous people flinch at sudden movement and fill silence with words. She moved through new environments with a quiet, attentive economy, taking in exits and faces and small details, the way someone does who has learned that the world is worth paying attention to and does not always announce its changes in advance. On the third morning, with Iron Hollow's walls finally visible against the gray sky, I pulled my horse beside hers. "The Crestmere record says no wolf shift," I said. "How long since your first attempt?" She glanced at me. "They tried the ritual 3 times, 14, 17, and 19. Nothing came. Nothing or nothing they chose to see." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, my lord. I only know what they told me." "What did they tell you?" "That I was a failed Omega, that a packmate without a wolf was a burden and an embarrassment." A pause, not bitter, just truthful, the way she was about everything. "That no alpha would ever want me, so I might as well make myself useful." I said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that would have fit the road and the cold and the stranger's company. But I felt it, the anger again, cleaner this time, quieter, the kind that does not burn but simply stays, the kind that has made decisions before the mind catches up. We rode through the gates of Iron Hollow as the morning light struck the stone walls and turned them briefly gold, and I thought, whoever told her that was wrong, and will not tell her so again. What followed was not simple. Iron Hollow was not a pack given to gentleness. We were a northern pack, a border pack, people who had built their walls out of necessity and kept them standing out of habit, and we did not easily warm to strangers. My council received the news of the new household member with the variety of expressions one might expect. Etta, my head housekeeper, who had run Iron Hollow's domestic operations with military efficiency for 20 years, looked at Sierra with the weighing assessment of a woman, deciding whether a new tool is well made or will break on first use. My senior council member, Lord Aldrich, a wide, gray-bearded man who had been advising the Iron Hollow throne since before my father's time, asked, directly and without apology, what use I intended for a wolfless Omega. "The same use as any capable person," I said, "whatever she is suited to and willing to do." Aldrich looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for decisions he considered financially questionable. "The council will note the purchase price was." "Note it," I said, and moved on. Aldrich was not finished, as it turned out. He came to find me the following morning before the council meeting and closed the door behind him. "My lord," he said, "I have been advising this throne for 31 years. I advised your father in the matter of the alliance marriage, and I advised you in the matter of the Ironfin border, and I have not been wrong about either. I would ask you to hear me on this." "I am hearing you," I said. "The purchase of an unclaimed Omega with no wolf shift from a gift auction at more than double the asking price will be noted across every pack in the northern realm within a fortnight. It will be interpreted." He looked at me steadily. "The interpretations will vary. Some will be flattering, some will not. I know that. Some will see weakness. An alpha who pays sentiment prices for surplus people is an alpha whose judgment is becoming soft." "And the others," I said. He paused. "The others will wait to see what she is. And then they will have their interpretation." He straightened. "I am asking whether you are prepared for either." I looked at him for a long moment. Aldrich had the quality of the best advisors. He asked questions not to undermine but to ensure you had already asked them yourself. He wanted to know whether I had thought this through, not whether I could be talked out of it. I paid 100 silver, I said, because she was worth considerably more than that, and the price the room was willing to offer was an embarrassment. I am not confused about what I did or why. Whether the other pack see it clearly is their concern, not mine. Aldrich looked at me. You've already decided, he said. I had decided, I said, before the gavel came down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, then I will note in the council record that the Alpha's judgment was exercised deliberately and will not be revisited. He opened the door. She had better be useful, my lord. She will be, I said, and I believed it. It was Etta in the end who placed her. Ironhallow's stores of medicinal herbs were in disarray. The old healer had retired the previous spring, and her replacement was competent but stretched thin across 3 villages. And Etta, who was nothing if not practical, put Sira to work in the herb stores the second morning. By the third morning, 2 of the kitchen maids had begun stopping in on their breaks. By the end of the week, a line had formed outside the small workroom that Etta had allocated to her, comprised primarily of pack members with ailments they had been carrying quietly because the healer was too busy and the road to the next village too long. I heard about it from Karan. She's not charging them, he said, in the careful tone of a man reporting something mildly bewildering. They bring what they have, a bit of food, a handful of herbs from their own gardens, and she uses it or doesn't as she sees fit, and she sees them. All of them. All of them. The waiting list is, at present, 14 people long. She arrived 6 days ago. I said nothing, but I walked past the workroom that evening, not entirely by accident, and I looked through the open door. She was seated at the work table, a woman twice her age across from her, the woman's hands spread flat on the table between them while Sira examined them with the focused attention of someone reading something important. She was talking quietly, instructions, it sounded like, for something to do with warmth and rest, and a poultice made from the yellow root she had found at the back of the neglected stores. The woman's face, which had been tight with the specific exhaustion of chronic pain, had loosened. Not gone, not yet, but loosened. I stood there longer than I needed to, and then I walked away before she looked up. The hard thing came in the 3rd week. Ironhallow's great wolf, the ancient bonded wolf of the Ironhallow Alpha line, a creature called Vale who had been bound to my family for 4 generations, had been dying for 6 months. Not dramatically, not suddenly. The way very old things die, slowly, by degrees, pulling inward. Vale was the largest of Ironhallow's wolves, silver-white from age, and he had not eaten properly since midsummer. The pack healer had done everything she could. The bond he carried with the Ironhallow bloodline was old and complicated, and she believed it was the bond itself straining, that something in it had frayed, that the Alpha line's blood was asking the old wolf to carry something it could not find in me alone, and that without that missing anchor, Vale was letting go. I had not spoken of this to anyone outside the pack. The great wolf's health was not a weakness I was willing to advertise to the southern packs, not when 3 of them had been watching our northern borders with the attentive patience of people waiting for an opportunity. I had not spoken of it to Sira. She found it herself. I do not know what took her to the wolf enclosures at that hour. She told me later that one of the kitchen boys had mentioned, in passing, that the big gray one hadn't eaten in a week and was making a sound that frightened him, and she had gone to see if there was something simple she could offer. It was not simple. Nothing about Vale was simple. But when I walked out from the evening council meeting and took the path toward the kennels to check on him, as I did every evening without exception, I found her sitting on the cold stone floor inside the enclosure with Vale's great head in her lap. He was asleep. I stopped. I could not remember the last time Vale had slept without visible distress, without the restless, painful shifting that had become his constant state these last months. He was not shifting now. His sides rose and fell with the slow, even depth of real rest, and her hand moved in gentle, steady strokes along the fur of his neck, from his jaw down to the thick ruff at his shoulders, with the methodical patience of someone who has been sitting here long enough to find the rhythm that helps. She looked up when she heard me stop. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry, which I appreciated. "I should have asked. How long has he been like that?" "An hour, perhaps." She did not stop her hand. "He was in pain when I arrived. I don't have anything for a wolf this size, not the right medicines, nothing in the stores that would touch something this deep. But warmth sometimes helps, and I know certain pressure points from the old healer's notes I found at the back of the workroom, and he seemed to want the company." She paused. "I think he has been alone in this for a long time." I crouched down on the far side of the enclosure. Vale's ear moved slightly at my proximity, the old familiar acknowledgement, the one that said he knew me, that said he was still here, even as he'd been growing quieter and quieter these past months. "He doesn't accept company easily," I said. "No," she said, "but he accepted it tonight." We sat there in silence for a while, long enough that the stars moved and the night deepened, and the enclosure went from merely cold to genuinely bitter. Karan appeared in the entrance at some point, took one look at the scene, the alpha of Ironhollow crouched on the floor of a wolf enclosure at midnight, and silently withdrew. I would hear about this from him in the morning. I was quite certain about that. "What do you think is wrong with him?" I asked eventually. She considered the question with the same seriousness she applied to everything. "I think he's tired," she said. "Not dying tired, just the kind of tired that comes from carrying something alone for too long, waiting for something to arrive that hasn't come yet." A pause. "I could be wrong. I'm not a wolf bond healer, but that is what it feels like when I sit with him." I looked at her across the sleeping wolf. In the faint starlight the enclosure admitted, her face was very quiet, and I felt something that had nothing to do with anger and nothing to do with pity, something I had not felt before, that lived somewhere between recognition and peace. As though some long-held tension behind my ribs had, without warning, simply released. I told myself it was the late hour. In the morning, Vale ate. He had not eaten without coaxing in 6 months, and he ate that morning the way a healthy wolf eats, cleanly, thoroughly, without drama, cleaning the bowl and then sitting back on his haunches and looking around the enclosure with the alert air of a wolf who has remembered what it is to be present in the world. The pack healer came and went with an expression of baffled relief. Karan looked at me across the morning table and said nothing. Edda, who had never in 20 years shown surprise at anything, allowed herself a small, wondering pause before she carried on. I said nothing either, but that afternoon I stopped at the workroom doorway and I said to Sira, "Thank you." She looked up from the herbs she was sorting. "I didn't do much." "You did enough." She held my gaze for a moment, that clear, measuring look that I was beginning to know, that looked at everything honestly and reported back without embellishment. And then she nodded once and went back to her work. 3 days after that, one of the East Village elders arrived at the hall with a request. The East Village was the smallest of Ironhollow's 3 northern settlements, a cluster of stone houses at the edge of the tree line that had been losing people to the border towns for a generation because the winters were hard and the medical care was irregular. The elder, a woman in her 60s named Hesta, who had been running the village council since before I took the alpha seat, sat across from me in the great hall with her hands folded on the table, and said, carefully, that she had heard from 3 of the East Village families who had come up the road to the Ironhollow Hall this past week, and returned in a changed state. "Changed how?" I said. "Lindra's husband," she said, "hasn't slept without pain in 3 years, came back from that workroom sleeping through the night first time since the autumn fever 2 seasons back." She paused. "Bren's daughter, the one who stopped eating after her wolf bond failed, she asked for a meal yesterday morning, first time in 4 months." Another pause. Old Farrick, who hasn't left his house since his wife died last spring. He came up the road to Iron Hollow because someone in the village told him there was a healer who listened, and he came home and said she'd given him something to do, something useful, tending the medicinal garden at the south gate, and he looked. She stopped. He looked present again, is what he looked. I said nothing for a moment. We haven't had anything like that here since the old healer, Hesta said. The young one is fine. She does her rounds. But there's a difference between doing rounds and, she searched, and being the kind of person that things want to be near. I thought of Vale sleeping for the first time in months. I thought of the tension that had released in my chest on a cold stone floor. Yes, I said, there is. I came to ask, Hesta said carefully, whether she would be willing to visit the East Village, whether the Alpha would permit it, not to take her away, just to visit. There are families who cannot make the road. I said I would ask her, and I did. She said yes before I had finished the question. We rode out the following week, Sierra and Karan and 2 of the guards and myself, on a bright cold morning that smelled of pine resin and coming snow. She did not need me to manage the visit. She was perfectly capable of managing herself. But I found, when Karan delicately suggested I could send the party without accompanying them personally, that I had no intention of doing that. I told him I wanted to assess the village supply situation directly. He accepted this with the expression of a man who has decided not to argue the declared reason. The East Village spent most of the day around her. It was not my village's custom to crowd visitors, but they did not treat her as a visitor, which was the thing. They treated her as someone who had arrived late for something they had been waiting for. Old Farrick showed her the medicinal garden with the pride of a man who had found a purpose, and she asked him questions about the soil and the drainage with the full attention of someone who genuinely wanted to know. And by the time we rode back in the early dark, his back was straight in a way it hadn't been when we arrived. I watched all of this. I watched it carefully. Karan rode beside me on the way home and said, in the most carefully neutral voice he owned, "She is very good at this." "Yes," I said. "Remarkably good." "Karan," I said. "My lord," he said, and said nothing further. I walked away thinking about the tension that had released in my chest the night before, and trying, seriously, to convince myself it was still the late hour. It was not, of course. It came to me over the following weeks the way ice forms on still water from the outside in, slow and patient, and then suddenly, one morning, simply there. It was not a lightning moment. There was no single morning I woke knowing it. There was only the accumulated weight of small things. The way the pack began to move around her, not with deference exactly, but with the ease of people who have decided someone belongs. The kitchen boys who started leaving scraps of warmth herbs outside her workroom because they knew she ran out by midweek and the stores were slow to restock. Old Myra from the East Village, who had not walked the main road without her daughter's arm in 2 years, coming up the hill to the hall on her own to bring a jar of preserved apples and a shy, sincere thank you. The 2 youngest guards who had ridden north with us from the summit, who had started taking the long way back to the barracks after their morning drills, because the long way passed her workroom window and she usually waved. And Vale. Vale had begun sleeping outside her door each night. Not in the enclosure, not in the kennels outside her door, in the corridor of the inner hall, enormous and silver-white and immovable, like a piece of the building that had decided it preferred that particular location. The first time I found him there, I stopped in the corridor for a long moment, looking at him. He opened one eye, looked back at me with the ancient, patient certainty of a wolf who has already decided how things are, and closed it again. I had nothing to say to that. I walked back to my own quarters and thought about the tension behind my ribs, which had not returned. What I had not acknowledged, I began to acknowledge. It came first as a simple awareness. I found reasons to be in the main hall rather than the study. I found that the morning briefings I had always taken in private had migrated, over the course of a month, to the long table near the kitchen corridor, which was not the most convenient location for reviewing border dispatches, but was a location from which one could hear when the workroom was occupied and when it was not. I found myself bringing administrative problems into council that I would ordinarily have resolved alone, because several of them had implications for the village healer's supplies, and the most informed voice on the village healer's supplies was currently the person at the other end of the kitchen corridor. Karan said nothing about any of this. He was very good at saying nothing. He had been saying nothing about increasingly obvious things for 15 years, and had elevated it to an art form. It was Edda who finally spoke. She came to me on a gray Thursday morning, stood in the doorway of my study with her account ledgers under her arm, and said, "She has been here 2 months, and she has done more for this pack's welfare than the old healer managed in the last 3 years, and Vale is eating full meals and sleeping peacefully for the first time since your father's time, and the East Village is sending thank-you parcels, and you walk past her workroom 11 times a day." I put down the letter I was pretending to read. "I have counted," Edda said. 11. "Edda." "My lord," a tone suggesting she had no intention of being redirected. "She is a good woman. A genuinely good woman, not the kind who performs goodness in visible places and is something else in private. The kind who sits on a cold stone floor at midnight with an old wolf who is in pain because someone mentioned it was having a hard week and she could not let that pass. Your wolf knows it. Your pack knows it. Your kitchen boys know it. The question is what you intend to do." "I intend," I said with some difficulty, "to not discuss this with my head housekeeper." "As you like, my lord," she said, and placed the ledgers on my desk and left. She was right, of course. Edda was almost always right about things that mattered. I simply preferred to come to things in my own time. The confrontation came 3 weeks later from the Dunmore pack. The Dunmore Alpha, a man named Brett Carlin, had been watching Iron Hollow's northern hunting grounds with acquisitive interest for the better part of a decade. He had never had a real pretext to press the matter. Our borders were clear. Our agreements were current. But he was the kind of alpha who collected pretexts the way other men collect debts. And when the midwinter trade caravan came through Iron Hollow, it brought with it a young Dunmore sub-alpha named Varric who had come, ostensibly, to discuss winter trading terms. Within 2 days of his arrival, it became clear that his actual purpose was to assess the wolfless Omega from the auction. The news of my purchase had traveled, as news always does in the pack world, and the Dunmore pack had apparently decided that an unclaimed wolfless Omega in the Northern Alpha's household was an opportunity worth investigating before the situation resolved itself in a way that closed the door. I was in council, reviewing the season's timber counts, when Karan appeared in the doorway. "The Dunmore representative," Karan said carefully, "has presented himself at the workroom. He has asked the healer woman whether she might consider a position in the Dunmore household, which would come with what he described as a considerably warmer climate and considerably higher standing." I set down the timber count. She told him she was satisfied at Iron Hollow and was not considering other positions. A pause. He asked her 3 times. She gave him the same answer each time. I stood up. "He is still in the corridor," Karan said. "My lord," he stopped. Whatever was in my face stopped him. It had been stopping him with increasing frequency over the past several weeks. I walked out of the council chamber and down the corridor at a pace that the 2 passing guards registered, pressing themselves to the wall to let me by. I came around the corner to find the young Dunmore sub-alpha still standing in the workroom doorway with the expression of a man who had not accepted no as a final answer, which is a quality I have never found admirable in anyone. He saw me and went perfectly still. "My Lord Velthar," he said, with rapid recalibration. "Varric," I said, "the trade discussions concluded this morning. Your caravan departs at noon." I held his gaze without expression. Iron Hollow's household members are not available for external recruitment. That policy applies to every member of this household without exception. Do you understand it clearly? He understood it very clearly. He left at noon. I stood in the corridor for a moment after he went, feeling the unreasonable, certain thing that had driven me here settle into something quieter and more honest. Then I heard a sound from the workroom, a small sound, something between amusement and exasperation, and I turned. She was at the work table, her back partially to the door, working with the small stone pestle she used for harder roots. Her shoulders were shaking very slightly. "You're laughing," I said. "No," she said with perfect composure. "I'm working." "You are laughing." She turned around, and her expression was the most open I had seen it in 2 months, not composure now, but something warmer and younger than composure, her mouth not entirely successfully suppressing what it wanted to do. "He was very persistent," she said. "And you were very," she considered her word, "direct." "I am always direct," I said. "You walked down here very quickly." I walked at my normal pace. The guards pressed against the wall. I was quiet for a moment. Something in the way she was looking at me, that same clear, honest appraisal, but warmer now than I had first seen it, seasoned by 2 months and an old wolf and the accumulated small hours of a household finding its way, made the careful management of the previous weeks feel, suddenly, like exactly what it was: unnecessary. "Sira," I said. "My lord," she said carefully, "I would like to speak with you this evening, not about the Pax business, not about the herb stores or Vale or the village supply lists." I kept my gaze on her steadily. "About you, and about me, and about what seems to be present at this end of the corridor that neither of us has named yet. Will you come to the study after the evening meal?" The measuring look was there again. She was reading me the way she had read the auction hall, honestly, without flinching, without the kindness that softens a reading into something more comfortable than accurate. I did not look away. I had nothing to hide, and I was done pretending otherwise. "Yes," she said, "I'll come. What passed between us that evening in the study I will keep, as some things should be kept, between the two of us. I will say some of it, because it matters." I told her the truth, which was that I was a man who had spent 10 years running a cold and capable kingdom, and had been very good at the cold and capable parts, and genuinely poor at everything else, and that she had walked into the hall at Ashenvale with her hands folded, and her chin steady, and something had released in my chest that had not tightened again, and that I was done managing it as though it were a problem to be solved. I told her I was asking, not arranging, that she was free to say no, and free to leave Iron Hollow with her full placement fee, and a genuine letter of reference and my sincere good wishes, and that nothing would change on the basis of her answer. Not her work, not her welcome, not Vale sleeping outside her door, which had at this point become an established fact of the hall's geography. She looked at me for a long moment in the firelight of the study, that clear, measured look that I had watched her apply to every situation she encountered, that never softened a thing into something more comfortable than honest. Then she said, "May I ask you something first?" "Yes," I said. "At the auction," she said, "when you raised your hand, what did you see?" I thought about it. "A room full of people who had decided someone was worth nothing," I said, "and the evidence that they were wrong." "That was what you saw." "That was what I saw first, then I saw you." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you see when you saw me?" I considered how to be accurate. "Someone who knew exactly what was happening and had decided not to be broken by it," I said. "Someone who was worth considerably more than 40 silver, and who clearly knew it, and who was waiting with remarkable patience for the room to stop being wrong." Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, just the faint movement of something that has been held very still for a very long time, releasing. "The Cressmere Pact told me for 9 years that I was a liability," she said. That I was taking up space that a true wolf-bearer would use better, that they would have cast me out sooner if I hadn't been useful in the herb stores. She paused. I never stopped knowing they were wrong, but knowing it alone is, she looked at the fire, a cold kind of knowing. Yes, I said, it is. You raised your hand, she said, in a room full of alphas for someone no one wanted, and then you told me I was not a debt and not a prisoner. You were not, I said, you are not. I know, she said. That is the thing. She looked back at me. I could see that you meant it. I have spent 23 years learning to read when people mean what they say because the cost of being wrong about that has been high, and you meant it. I said nothing. The fire settled. Outside the study window, the first real snow of the season was beginning. I could see it in the changed quality of the dark, the particular softness of snowlight coming through the shutters. I told you I was not certain what I felt, she said. That is true. I am not certain of most things until I am entirely certain of them, but I am willing to find out, if you are willing to give me time to do it properly. I am a patient man, I said, when I have decided something is worth waiting for. She smiled, a real one, full, the one I had been catching glimpses of for months. I know that too, she said. I told her I was asking, not arranging. She told me she understood the difference and valued it. We sat in the study until the fire burned low and the snow was coming steadily outside the window, talking about small things and large ones. And by the time we said good night at the door of the corridor, something between us had been named that could not be unnamed. That was enough, more than enough. What followed was the clearest season of my life. I learned that she rose before dawn and that the kitchen fire was always lit when the morning staff arrived, because she had been an early riser since childhood and did not like to sit idle while the world was still deciding what it was doing. I learned that she had read more than anyone I knew, not the formal histories that line a lord's study but the practical texts, the healer's manuals and the agricultural records, and the annotated accounts left by traveling merchants, the kind of knowledge that comes from wanting to understand how things actually work. I learned that she had a dry, precise humor that appeared only in private and was better than anything I encountered in the formal world of councils and summit negotiations. I learned that she was not intimidated by the council. This became clear at the midwinter review, when Aldrich presented the annual border security assessment and made a remark, not unkindly, but in the offhand way that people make remarks about things they consider settled, that the East Village was not worth the cost of its own maintenance and should be considered for consolidation with the central settlement. She was in the hall that day because I had begun including her in the supply discussions, and she said, quietly and without apology, that the East Village's medicinal garden had produced 3 times its expected yield this season, and that the families there, if properly supplied and supported, represented a more reliable border watch than any contracted garrison, because people defend their own homes. She had numbers. She had sourced the numbers from the pack records that Aldrich himself had compiled, which he had apparently not revisited recently enough to know they supported her argument and not his. The council meeting ran an hour longer than scheduled. The East Village was not consolidated. Aldrich said nothing to me afterward, but at the following week's council meeting, he brought the North Road supply ledgers, which she had recommended updating, and presented them as though they had been his own idea, which was as close to an acknowledgment as Aldrich had ever offered anyone. I learned that she had opinions about the border supply routes and was entirely correct about them, which I discovered when she mentioned, carefully and without presumption, that the Eastern Supply Road the council had been arguing about for 3 years was less efficient than the old northern track that the previous Alpha had abandoned 30 years ago. I took the northern track on the autumn inspection. She was right. I reassigned the supply caravans, and the 3 northern villages had their winter stores in before the first hard freeze for the first time in a decade. Karan said nothing about any of this. His expression in council for the following month, however, suggested a man who had reached a series of conclusions and was managing the satisfaction of having reached them correctly. I learned that Vale had, in the way of ancient wolves who decide they have found where they belong, begun following her through the hall, not at a guard's distance, at a companion's distance, at her heel or at her side, or occasionally pressing his great silver head against her hand when she paused in a corridor, and he felt, in that wordless way of old wolves, that this was the moment for it. The pack noticed. The pack always notices such things, and Vale had not chosen anyone's company in 4 years. The old moonseer, a woman named Farrier who had served 3 alphas and was not given to sentiment, came to find me on an evening in the deep winter, when the hall was quiet and the snow was a foot deep against the gate, and told me that the great wolves of the alpha line had never been wrong about such things in the 4 generations she had watched them. Wrong about what? I said, though I already knew. About the mate, she said. About who belongs beside the alpha's seat. She looked at me steadily. She was very old, Farrier, and she had the quality of people who have outlasted enough events to have stopped being impressed by most of them. Vale chose your father's Luna before your father had spoken a word to her. Vale chose your grandfather's mate before the ceremony was arranged. In both cases, the ones who were chosen turned out to be the ones the line needed. And now, I said. Now, she said, with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact that is finished, he sleeps at her door. He follows her in the hall. He ate again because she sat with him on a cold floor. A pause. The line needs what it needs, my lord. It always has. She said it once and did not repeat it. She did not need to. Slowly, in the way of things that do not arrive with fanfare but settle into place like the right piece of a puzzle, I understood what I was feeling. What it had been, perhaps, from the moment of a gavel in a smoke-stained hall. The bond between an alpha king and his fated mate is not a story the southern packs discuss much anymore. They consider it old lore, romantic excess, the kind of thing that belongs in the songs the old women sing, and not in the practical ledgers of running a pack in a complicated world. We in Ironhollow had always kept it closer. My father had felt it. My grandfather had written about it. The recognition that is not chosen and cannot be manufactured. The kind that moves between 2 people like water finding its level, patient and inevitable and entirely indifferent to the preferences of anyone it has chosen. I told her about the bond. She said, with the careful honesty that I had come to rely on the way other men rely on maps, I know, I've known for some time. I was waiting for you to name it. How long? I said. Since the night with Vale, she said, possibly before. She was watching me to see how I received this. I received it, I believe, with the expression of a man who is not surprised and is not certain why he ever managed to be. You could have mentioned it, I said. You had things to work through, she said. I could see that. I did not want to rush you past them. I looked at her for a moment. That is either extremely patient or mildly exasperating. I have been told, she said, that those are not necessarily different things. I laughed. I cannot tell you the last time I laughed in a conversation that did not involve Karan deliberately saying something outrageous. She looked pleased. In the contained way she looked pleased about things, and went back to her work, and I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to before I went back to mine. Slowly, in the way of things that do not announce themselves, but simply settle into the days until they are as unremarkable as breathing, the bond between us became the fact around which everything else arranged itself. There was no ceremony for it. There was no formal declaration in the hall. There was only the accumulated truth of 2 people who had decided to be honest with each other, and had found, in that honesty, something they had both, each in their own separate solitude, before they knew the other existed, been missing. She asked me, one evening, why I had never taken a Luna before. I told her that I had never trusted anyone enough, which was true, and that no one had ever made me feel that trust was something other than a risk, which was also true and somewhat surprised me to say out loud. She said she understood that. She had built her own walls for the same reason. What changed? I said. She thought about it for a moment. You said I was not a debt, she said. The night we arrived, no one in my life had ever said a version of that. No one had ever suggested that what I offered might be worth something without requiring me to also apologize for needing anything in return. She was quiet for a moment. It was a small thing. It was the obvious thing, I said. The obvious things, she said, are often the ones no one says. I had nothing to answer that with. I thought it was probably the truest thing anyone had said to me in 10 years of governing, and I filed it alongside the North Road supply ledgers and the East Village's medicinal garden numbers, in the private category of things she had told me that had permanently improved my understanding of how the world worked. The Summit of Pax comes once each decade. By the year of its next convening, I had been planning what I intended to do for 6 months, and Karan had been quietly supporting the planning for 5, and pretending for all of it that he was merely helping with the travel arrangements. The 5 great packs and a scattering of the northern border packs gathered again in Ashenvale in the early autumn, and the hall was nearly as I remembered it, the same smoke-stained stone, the same long tables, the same arranged alliances and deliberate seating. The Dunmore Alpha arrived with his full council and the Sub-Alpha Varric, who was not pleased to see me. The Westhello and Grayville packs settled their delegations in their usual places. The Ironfin Alpha, with whom I had finally and satisfactorily resolved the boundary dispute of the previous summit, gave me a civil nod from across the room. The auctioneer with his silver chain of office was already setting up near the back hall, prepared for the gift auction at the evening's close. He would not be needed. I had sent word of that ahead of time, a private note to the summit administration, with a sum that covered the administrative costs and a request that the evening's final item be struck from the agenda. The note had been accepted without question. Iron Hello's gold has always been reliable, even if Iron Hello's fashionability has not. She stood beside me as the summit proceedings opened. She wore her Iron Hello colors properly now, the deep gray and silver of the northern pack, a wool dress well made and warm, her dark hair dressed with a silver pin that Etta had pressed upon her the morning we left, and that she had worn without fuss. She was the same as she had always been. The hall had changed around her, or more precisely, the people in it were reading her differently now, with the particular attention that gathers around someone who has been much discussed and not yet seen. Curiosity, reassessment, in 2 or 3 faces, something that looked almost like recognition, as though what they were seeing confirmed something they had already suspected they had gotten wrong. Vale had traveled with us. He was old and the road had been long and cold, and he had slept most of it in the supply wagon, which my guards had arranged with cushioning that I pretended not to notice. He stood now at her left side in the great hall, silver-white and vast, his age visible in the careful way he held himself but his presence entirely undimmed. The room's reaction to that was, I will admit, satisfying in a specific and uncomplicated way. The trading and border negotiations filled the afternoon. In the evening, as the tables were rearranged for the formal closing ceremony, the tradition by which each Alpha line renewed their acknowledgement of the assembled summit and presented any significant changes in pack structure, I rose. Iron Hello has 1 presentation, I said. The hall attended. At the last gathering of this assembly, I said, a young woman named Sira was offered in the gift auction. Every pack in this hall declined her. I did not raise my voice. The room's quiet was sufficient. She was passed over because she had no recorded wolf shift, because her original pack had decided she was without worth. The starting bid was 40 silver. No hand rose, not one in this room. A pause. I paid 100 silver for her placement. Not out of pity, not out of impulse. I let the words be plain and unhurried, because anyone who had taken 30 seconds to look honestly at the woman on that platform could see that this assembly had made a significant error in judgment, and I do not leave significant errors in judgment uncorrected when I have the means to address them. The Dunmore Alpha's jaw was very tight. The auctioneer near the back hall had gone perfectly still. Several of the advisors were looking at the table. In the year since that auction, I continued, the woman you passed on for 40 silver has restored the health of Iron Hollow's 3 northern villages. She is the reason our East Village stores were stocked before the first freeze for the first time in a decade. She healed Vale of Iron Hollow, the oldest bonded wolf in the northern realm, when no healer I could find had managed it in 6 months of trying. She has the trust of every member of my household, the devotion of my pack, and the company of that wolf, who has let no one near him in 4 years and who has, for the past 10 months, chosen to sleep at her door. I turned to her. Tonight, before this assembly, I am naming her my Luna. The hall did not erupt. It went profoundly, completely still. I took her hand. The bond ignited then, the way it does when 2 people who have been living inside it finally name it before witnesses. The mate mark blazed gold on both our wrists at once, the paired crescentan star of the Iron Hollow Alpha line appearing on her skin as though it had simply been waiting for permission, which I have always believed it had. Vale lifted his great silver head and made the low, resonant sound that the oldest pack songs call the bonded wolf's confirmation, the sound that says the wolf line of the Alpha has recognized its true mate. It was a sound most people in that hall had only heard in stories. It carried. Every wolf in the room heard it. Every person in the room heard it too. The Dunmore Alpha rose first. I had thought for a moment that it would be an objection, and I had been prepared to address it, but he read the room the way careful men read rooms when the room has already decided something without them, and he bowed. Just that. A clean, reluctant, honest bow from a man who understood when the ledger had settled. The Westerlo Alpha rose and bowed. The Ironfin Alpha rose. The East Village delegation from Iron Hollow itself, who had made the journey to the summit with their own small trade concerns, and a parcel of preserved apples that Sierra had laughed about when she found it loaded into the supply wagon, rose from the back of the hall and bowed, pack member by pack member, in the unhurried way of people who have already known for some time what the occasion was. The room rose. Not because ceremony required it, not because I had commanded it, because a room full of people who know they have witnessed something real and right will rise, even those among them who might have preferred a different outcome. It is, I have found, one of the few reliable things about formal gatherings. She stood beside me with the mate mark blazing gold on her wrist, and her face was what it had always been, that deep, still composure that looked like distance to people who did not know her, and that I knew was something else entirely. Something that had never been broken by the Cressmere pack or the auction or the hall that had looked at her and looked away, because she had never needed the hall's recognition to know what she was worth. She had only needed the hall to be honest in the end, and that is what it was. "You could have been louder," she said, quietly to me alone, in the gap before the formal response was required of me. I was exactly as loud as the situation required, I said. She looked at me sidelong. The not suppressed quite enough expression was there, warm and young and entirely hers. "You are always exactly as loud as the situation requires." "I am," I agreed. "It has served me well." "It has," she said, and the hall was still rising, pack by pack, in the long amber light of the Ashenvale torches. I think sometimes of the gavel striking 3 times in that hall a year ago, and the silence that followed it. I think of her face in that silence, the held gaze, the still hands, the refusal to make herself smaller in the presence of a room that had decided she was not worth 40 silver. She had known what she was worth. She had known it in the Cressmere pack when they told her she was a burden. She had known it when the bidding fell to nothing and the hall looked away. She had known it every cold morning she lit a fire that someone else would be warm by. Every hour she sat with a wolf in pain because no one should have to carry pain alone. Every day she did the work quietly and without fanfare, and let the work speak for itself. The haul at Ashenvale was only catching up. What I had bought at 100 silver was never mine in the way that can be owned. It was hers, the worth, the gift, the particular rare quality of her that every pack in that room had been offered and had passed over, and would spend a long time measuring the cost of having done so. I had simply been the one with the sense to see it, standing at the back of a room full of people who had made a decision together and had all been wrong together, and the means to say so. There are mornings now when I walk the northern walls of Ironhollow before the day begins, and the hall is quiet, and Vale is sleeping at the foot of the stairs, because he has decided that location suits him better than any other, and the kitchen fire is already lit because she has already been awake an hour, and finds the dark morning useful for things she wants to think through without interruption. And I think about what it cost, 100 silver, and the willingness to raise a hand in a room where no one else would, and I count myself, on every one of those mornings, exactly as fortunate as I am. I would do it 1,000 times again. I would do it for nothing, for a single silver coin, for the chance to stand in that hall and say, before every pack that had gathered and looked and turned away, "You were wrong, and here is why." She is my Luna, not because the summit bowed, though it did, not because the mate mark blazes, though it does and will, because on a cold stone floor in the middle of the night she sat with an old wolf who was tired of carrying something alone, and she stayed until he was not alone anymore. That is who she is. That is who she has always been. The world simply needed a little time to notice.